Hello, my menopausal scientists. Welcome back to Your Menopause Your Way. This is where you learn everything you need to know in order to manage your menopause your way successfully. If you're new to my channel, you should know that I'm Menopause Taylor and I'm a real nerd. I do everything in a very orderly, pedantic, organized manner. And that's how I deliver this education too. So it's designed the same way your studies in school were back in the day, in units. Unlike most YouTube channels where the topics are all topsy-turvy, mine isn't. And that's because unlike videos on things like, makeup and hair and such, a real education on menopause warrants learning the information in a logical, stepwise manner. So I always implore you to start at video 1 and watch them all in order. This is video number 252, and the Alzheimer's unit began with video 236. So there are 16 Alzheimer's videos that precede this one. This menopause education here on YouTube is not a quick study. If you're a person who wants the whole education pronto, get my book. All of chapter 33 is on Alzheimer's. This is the first edition, this is the second edition. If a book isn't to your liking, get the entire education from my webinars or the DVD, both available from my website. What I deliver here on YouTube is very detailed and slow so that all women, regardless of education or first language, can benefit from it. Recently, we addressed the effect of estrogen and progesterone on your brain in video 249. Then we tackled the effect of menopause on your brain in video 250. And last week we dealt with the effect of different types of menopause on your brain in video 251. So today it's time to address the research on Alzheimer's disease and HRT. One of the things you've learned in this menopause education already is that sometimes you feel confused by what you think is conflicting information. But once you get the complete education, you realize that there was no conflicting information. You just didn't have the whole story. And once you do have the whole story, you are better able to use the information logically to make wise decisions for yourself. So the reason you should watch this video is because, as with everything else, you hear conflicting information about the effect of HRT on your risk for Alzheimer's. And this video will show you that there really is no conflicting information about it at all. My goal in this video is to tell you about the research on HRT and Alzheimer's. But I think the best way to do that is to put each research study in context. And the context we'll use is the long list of risk factors for Alzheimer's disease that I created for you in video 245. Here's the chart we created in that video. Here in the first column, you see that there are 2 categories of risk factors for Alzheimer's disease. And then in the second column, you see a big long list of individual risk factors. One of the most basic things about the scientific method is isolation. Isolation means the ability to study the effect of one thing at a time without interference from anything else that could sway the results. Because the only way you can possibly know the influence of one single factor on a disease is to make sure something else isn't contributing. Scientists look for all sorts of ways to mask the effect of one risk factor in order to study the effect of another risk factor. Well, when it comes to Alzheimer's, that's not easy. Just take a look at that long list of risk factors again. The first one is age. It is impossible to mask age in order to study the effect of HRT on Alzheimer's. It's not like you can give HRT to young premenopausal women and compare their rate of Alzheimer's to old postmenopausal women. And the next one is genetics. You learned in video 248 that there are a variety of genetic mutations that can contribute to your risk of Alzheimer's, but they differ greatly in terms of their tendency to express themselves, and some of them are modifiable with your lifestyle while others are not. Unless every single study subject undergoes genetic testing to omit a genetic mutation as a possible contributor to Alzheimer's, The study results will not be isolated for the effect of HRT on your risk for Alzheimer's. Family history falls along the same lines. What if some of the study subjects were adopted and don't know their family histories? And if you jump down to that big category of risk factors for a heart attack, I mean, my goodness, how many people have a bunch of those? My point is that you cannot take the results of any study at face value. You have to apply the science I've taught you in these videos rather than just assuming the study is the final word. And more important than anything else is to always remember that the study did not study you. How much you resemble the study population is one of the most critical aspects of using the information from any study. So be careful about using the results of a study as if it were a study on you. Do your own self-study to see how things apply to you because you are unique. So I'll present various studies on Alzheimer's and HRT, and as we go along, I'll point out some of the things about each one. Here are the items I'm going to be bringing to your attention. Study design, objectives of the study, characteristics of the study population, size of the study population, duration of the study, actual conclusions, how well the conclusions pertain to the objectives, climate of HRT use at the time, and limitations of the study. Let me start by explaining what each of those things mean. Study design is another way of designating the type of study. Have you ever thought about the different ways a scientist can design a study? There are three basic things that play into study design. They are study subjects, viewpoint, and size. Study subjects pertains to the way in which the scientist groups or separates the subjects in order to compare them. One way to do this is to do what is called a cohort study. A cohort study examines a group of subjects who are similar to one another. This would be like studying only postmenopausal women of a certain age who have been postmenopausal for the same length of time, who have no genetic mutations, and who have never taken HRT before the study. Or it could mean studying only perimenopausal women of a certain age with no genetic mutations and giving them all HRT before they become postmenopausal. In both situations, all the subjects would be similar from the start. The opposite of a cohort study is a random study. A random study examines a random group of subjects, ignoring their differences. This would entail making no attempt to distinguish their age, menopausal status, genetics, or previous HRT use. Based on what you've already learned in this Alzheimer's unit, do you see how those two study designs would produce very different results? Another factor that affects study subjects is whether or not there is something called matching of subjects and controls. Matching means pairing one subject with one control, making sure they are similar with regard to the things that could sway the results. So this would be like matching one 60-year-old postmenopausal woman who has been postmenopausal for 10 years and has never taken HRT with another 60-year-old woman who is postmenopausal, who has been postmenopausal for 10 years, but who has taken HRT. The matching of subject and control would serve to erase other things that could sway the results. The opposite is not matching the subjects and controls. Without matching, there is no attempt to take the similarities or differences between a subject and a control into account. So this would be like taking two women, regardless of their age, length of time in postmenopause, or history of HRT use, and comparing them. Do you see how those two study designs would produce very different results? And a third factor pertaining to study subjects is the presence or absence of something called blinding. Blinding is when someone doesn't know whether the subject is receiving a real medication or a placebo. And there are two different kinds of blinding. There's single blinding, meaning that the scientist knows, but the study subject doesn't. And there's double blinding, which means that neither knows. Blinding prevents people from influencing their own perceptions based on whether they receive the real medication or not. I mean, face it, knowing that you should get a particular result can influence your perception of whether or not you really are experiencing that result. And sometimes there's no blinding at all. In that case, both the scientist and the subjects know full well if they're getting the real thing or not. And this knowledge can sway the results. So the topic of study subjects alone in a study design has 3 subtopics. There's cohort versus random study, matching versus no matching, and blinding, whether double, single, or none at all. The next aspect of study design to consider is viewpoint. This pertains to whether the study is forward-looking or backward-looking. Of course, scientists don't use the words forward-looking and backward-looking. Instead, they use the words prospective and retrospective. A prospective study begins in the present and conducts the study into the future, moving forward in time as events occur. A retrospective study begins in the present and studies what happened in the past, looking at things after the fact. So if a scientist starts a prospective study today and designs the study just so, controlling all the things that can affect the results, there will be fewer unknowns. But that also means that the scientist can manipulate the situation to his or her liking more too. Alternatively, if a scientist starts a retrospective study today and just looks back into the past, he can't affect the results, but he also can't assess anything else that may have contributed to the results either. Do you see how there isn't necessarily a good way versus a bad way, or a right way versus a wrong way? What's important is to understand that these things will affect the results. So the topic of viewpoint in a study design has 2 subtopics, prospective and retrospective. And finally, there's study size. And the bottom line is that size matters. A large study is more informative than a small study. If a study examines 10,000 women, it has more value than one that studied 100 women. This is simply because the more people you study, the more information you can get. But stop a moment. That does not change the fact that they did not study you. If a study of 10,000 women says one thing and your own body says another, which are you going to believe? There's something counterintuitive about this, isn't there? Generally speaking, large studies are those that examine 1,000 or more subjects, and small studies are those that examine 100 to 999. So the topic of study size in a study design has 2 subtopics, large and small. Large being greater than 1,000 and small less than 1,000. Now, to address the other factors on this list, most of their meanings are obvious. The objectives of a study are what it hopes to accomplish. Usually it wants to answer a question, and in this case, the question is, does HRT prevent Alzheimer's? The characteristics of the study population are the details about the study group, their ages, their health status, whether or not they have taken HRT in the past, etc., etc. The duration of the study is how long the study endured. Did it assess the results after 2 years, or after 20, or 30, or 40 years? Some results manifest in the long term, but not in the short term, and vice versa. The actual conclusions are precisely that. What did the study conclude? This is the stuff you hear from the media. However, it is rarely accurate as presented by the media. How well the conclusions pertain to the objectives addresses whether or not the researchers kept their eye on the ball, as we say in law. Did they stay focused on the question at hand? Or did they get distracted and stray into answering some other question that was not the original question? I know it sounds crazy, but you would be surprised. The limitations of a study are all the things about it that could contaminate or sway the results. These come in many forms. The subjects may not have been the best. The study might have been too short. The results might have been manipulated. In other words, limitations are all the things that make a study anything but the final word. They constitute all the reasons I remind you that the study did not study you. All right, so let's delve into the few studies on Alzheimer's and HRT, and let's create one of our nifty charts as we go along. Here's the chart we will be filling in. All you see now are the factors we'll consider for each study, which include study name, year, study design, objectives of the study, characteristics of the study population, duration of the study, actual conclusions, how well the conclusions pertain to the objectives, climate of HRT use at the time, and limitations of the study. The first study to list is the Epidemiologic Catchment Area, or ECA study. It studied women aged 31 to 94, and it showed that the earlier you become postmenopausal, the higher your risk for Alzheimer's. This is in keeping with what you learned in video 251 about the effect of premature menopause on your brain. Well, for scientists, that set the stage for more studies. But here's ECA on our chart. So you see that this study was done by interviewing subjects, which means that there was no control over any other factors that may contribute. But the age range was vast, which is a big benefit. However, 13 years isn't really that long compared to how long you spend as a menopausal woman. So every study has some flaws, even though we also get some valid information from each one. After that study, there were multiple studies that demonstrated a reduction in the risk for Alzheimer's disease with HRT. So all these studies together set the stage from the mid-1900s until the early 2000s, when it was a matter of routine to give women HRT when they became postmenopausal. Of course, this was when patients never asked questions about anything their doctor told them to do. It was when the common response to a doctor's words were, "Whatever you say, doctor." And in the case of menopausal medicine, most of the doctors were men and all the patients were women, which made it even more unlikely that the patient would question anything. So for over 50 years, your doctor simply said, "Take this," when you became postmenopausal, and the "this" was HRT. The patient obeyed the doctor and took the HRT, and even though most of them had no idea what it was, they took it. If you ask a 90-ish-year-old lady if she ever took anything for her menopause, she'll initially brush it off, saying, "Oh, it was nothing, honey." But then she'll cock her head and she'll say, "I remember taking something called Premarin, because Premarin was the first HRT product ever developed." And the mere fact that they can all remember the name of that medication after all this time is an attestation in and of itself to the benefit it had on their brains. These 90-year-old women are the sharp, savvy, spunky women we all admire today. I have a friend like that. She's 92. We play Scrabble together, the old-fashioned way, sitting at a table together with the board and the little wooden tiles. I'm the only person she knows who will play Scrabble with her. And that's because she's so good. I'm good at Scrabble, but she beats me half the time. Oh, and the other reason nobody else will play with her is because of all her strict rules. If a word is already on the board, Barbie, in any form, you cannot play it again. She does not allow any of those ridiculous two-letter words like ma, pa, ha. Oh, and if you add an S to the end of a word, you only get 1 point for the S. But If you add an S in a way that changes the meaning of a word, you get the whole word. So pot to pots gives you only 1 point, but pot to spot gives you the whole word. So let's add this 50-year period of time to our chart. It's not a study, but rather a general consensus and practice at the time. And it belongs with the studies because it constituted the climate of HRT use at the time for a long time. Here I've just indicated that for the 50 years between about 1950 to 2002, all women took HRT because of the belief at the time that it was prevented Alzheimer's and improved the mental functions of women as they age. Then, after half a decade of demonstrating that HRT prevented Alzheimer's and improved the mental abilities of women at all ages, that disastrous WHI, or Women's Health Initiative study, came along. That's the one that turned your menopausal world completely upside down. But there was more to it than you ever heard. In addition to the distorted results you heard, there were spin-off studies from the WHI. One of those was called the WHI Memory Study, or WIMS. So after the WHI reported that HRT caused heart attacks instead of preventing them and wasn't beneficial for preventing bone loss, it examined the same WHI data for the effect of HRT on risk of Alzheimer's. And surprise, surprise, just as it had refuted all the data from all the previous studies on heart attacks and bone loss, it claimed that HRT doubled the risk of Alzheimer's in women aged 65 and older. In a later video in this Alzheimer's unit, I will address just this WIMS study. That will be when we get to the hormonal management options for preventing Alzheimer's. For now, I will not get into the nitty-gritty details. Suffice it to say that as with all the other data from the WHI, the data on the relationship between HRT and Alzheimer's was completely bogus. The truth was that women who did not already have cognitive impairment had a lower risk of ever getting Alzheimer's. So I'll add this to our chart showing its intended results, which were erroneous, rather than the actual results. And I'm doing it that way because in the world of research, each study sets the stage for the next study. And this one erroneous study directed subsequent ones in the wrong direction. What you see is that I've added the WIMS study indicating that it was a random prospective study on women over age 65 that lasted 7 years, claimed that HRT did not prevent Alzheimer's, and single-handedly changed the climate of HRT from pro to con. Okay, so now we had a situation in which, after decades of believing one thing, this one huge study refuted everything we had believed. And because the WHI was the largest study ever done, the assumption was that it carried a lot of weight. Never mind the fact that it broke every rule of the scientific method, and never mind the fact that the data was manipulated to scare the public. And never mind the fact that in the research world, we don't have studies that become Bibles. No study is ever the final word on anything. Nevertheless, that set the stage for the next step. In 2004, the American College of Obstetrics and Gynecology tried to assess the effect of HRT on Alzheimer's because there was so much conflicting information on it, but they could not draw any definitive conclusion. So you see, you aren't the only one who's confused. This is the most major obstetrics and gynecology organization anywhere, and it could not decide if HRT prevented Alzheimer's or not. But this was a retrospective review. It involved looking backward at all the studies that had been done so far, and that means they could not isolate the effect of HRT on Alzheimer's. Who knows how many of those other risk factors were at play? Probably all of them. But one thing that held was the increased risk with premature menopause. In fact, the younger postmenopause occurred, the greater the risk. And they also noted that women with Alzheimer's tended to have lower estrogen levels than women without. In criminal investigation, there's a saying, follow the money. I think there should be one for scientific studies. Follow the logic. But scientists tend to get bogged down in the minutia when all the general public wants is the bottom line. So that's why I present the range of studies to you in the same video. If I didn't, you'd come away from each video thinking I had contradicted myself from the last video. So here's our chart with the ACOG review added. So now you see that despite the fact that the ACOG review was an attempt to answer how HRT affected Alzheimer's, it was merely a review. So there were no study subjects and it failed to draw any conclusions. Next came the Chronos Early Estrogen Prevention Study, or KEEPS. Obviously, this one sought to see if taking estrogen early in your postmenopause prevented Alzheimer's. But it only studied the women over a period of 4 years. The problem with that lies in the fact that Alzheimer's disease takes years to make itself known. 4 years is just too short a time to examine for Alzheimer's. So the KEEPS study contributed very little to our knowledge. Here it is on our chart. After that came the early versus late intervention trial with estradiol study, or ELITE. And based on its name, you can tell that its objective was to determine if there was a difference in Alzheimer's rates between women who took HRT early in their postmenopause versus late in their postmenopause. So it compared women who started HRT in the first 6 years of postmenopause with women who started it 10 or more years after postmenopause. But it only lasted a little over 5 years. You see, this is getting into the timing question that is at the root of the estrogen window, and it failed to find any difference. Now, that could be because there weren't any differences, or it could be because of something about the study design, the subjects, or some limitation, or the duration. In any case, it failed to tell us more than we already knew. Notice that I don't elaborate on some of the details of these studies, and that's because they don't affect what you need to know in terms of facts. If you've ever read a real scientific study, you know that it's so detail-oriented that it can be exhausting. I won't make it so here. So here's our chart again. All right, the next study was the Cache County study. The Cache County is in Utah, and it consists of 91% Mormons. Why Mormons? Because they have a low rate of mortality before the age of 85. So this longevity lends itself to studying the effect of HRT over a long period of time. The Cache County study examined more than 2,000 women to assess their lifetime estrogen exposure from menarche to menopause. They took into account numbers of pregnancies, duration of breastfeeding, and HRT use. You've already learned that these things matter in terms of your risk for Alzheimer's. So of all the studies ever done, this one was the closest representation of real life. The results show that estrogen definitely had a beneficial effect on decreasing your risk of Alzheimer's. In fact, this study showed that for each additional month of exposure to estrogen, there was a 0.5% decline in the risk of Alzheimer's. That is a big deal, ladies. So this study is reconfirming what we thought back in the 1950s. Looking at our chart, you see that the Cache County study is the only one that examined estrogen exposure over a lifetime, and it had no limitations of significance. And most recently, a study from Finland was published in the British Medical Journal. And what do you know? It confused everyone once again. It claimed that Alzheimer's disease increased with longer duration on HRT. Now think about that. Could it be that the longer you've been on HRT, the older you are, and it's age rather than HRT increasing your risk? In this study, time since the onset of postmenopause was completely ignored. Well, you've seen that starting HRT early in postmenopause prevents Alzheimer's while starting it late in postmenopause does not. Wait a minute, isn't that precisely what the estrogen window is all about? So this Finland study took a step backwards, but the results were not significant enough to matter, and it was only a 3-year study. The very day after it came out, there were bulletins put out to doctors saying that it didn't change a thing. Do you see how studies can make your head spin? The lesson is this: never let a single study be the final answer. No one study is dogma. It's not like one study is the Bible. In general, the evidence is plentiful that estrogen prevents Alzheimer's. That's true whether it's your own body's estrogen, or estrogen from pregnancy, or estrogen from HRT. And if you have brain fog at postmenopause, it's a preview of things to come in the long term. Currently, we spend more money on breast implants and Viagra than on Alzheimer's research. This means that by the year 2040, there should be a large elderly population with perky boobs and huge erections, and absolutely no recollection of what to do with them. As usual, you can find the chart in the link just below this screen or at my website, which is menopausetailor.me, which is where you can also schedule a consultation. But you have to go to Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram to follow me, and you have to subscribe right here on YouTube. Come back next week to begin the videos on management options for preventing Alzheimer's. Bye!